Leslie thought the overdue bills were the biggest problem, until she discovered what was really behind Lawyer Lincoln's visit: a secret contract signed by her father, promising her as a New Year's companion. As soon as she read each clause, her knees trembled. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel, and let's get started. The sun had yet to rise when Leslie stepped into the workshop, the faint smell of burnt oil and tire dust lingering in the corners. She was used to arriving early, but this time, a pang of unease quickened her pace. The previous evening, she had overheard her father pleading on the phone, begging for more time to pay off a debt. The memory weighed heavily on her heart. She had always known he had been taking out loans for months, but she had never seen him so desperate. Switching on the fluorescent lights, she surveyed the remnants of the previous night's chaos. Bolts scattered across the floor, a tire iron abandoned on the counter, and a stack of overdue bills piled on the metal desk. Leslie sighed as she gathered the documents, her eyes scanning the overdue notices. Clenching her fist, she felt a mix of anger and worry. The workshop was her father's everything, but she feared that the mounting debts would ruin them completely. The muffled sound of someone speaking on the phone caught her attention. She immediately recognized her father's voice, pleading with someone on the other end. Leaving the papers, she followed the sound past two parked cars until she found him leaning against an old Chevrolet, his shoulders heavy with tension. He barely noticed her approach. "I promise. Just a few more days. I'll pay. I swear," he pleaded, his voice hollow with disbelief in his own assurances. Leslie stood frozen, watching him. She wanted to grab the phone from his hand and put an end to this torment. She couldn't bear seeing him so cornered, but something in his expression held her back. The call ended after a few more moments, and as he hung up, he bowed his head and closed his eyes, exhaling deeply. "Dad, what's going on?" Leslie asked, stepping closer. He turned to her abruptly, startled. She could see the exhaustion etched into every wrinkle on his face. "Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. I'll handle it. Trust me." But his voice lacked conviction. Leslie sighed deeply, suppressing her urge to press him further, and returned to work. She needed to fix an engine that had been sitting in the shop for days. The owner had threatened not to pay if the job was delayed any longer. Immersing herself in work was the only way to keep her anxiety at bay. As she worked on the vehicle's internals, she overheard two employees whispering nearby. "Word is, the boss got mixed up with some dangerous people." One said, "Yeah, I heard there's a wealthy client asking for something really strange in return." Leslie paused for a moment, holding her breath. This was news to her. What kind of deal could it be? Her curiosity nearly compelled her to join the conversation, but she decided to stay calm. Rumors spread quickly, and she preferred to get answers straight from her father. By noon, sweaty and with her hair hastily tied into a bun, Leslie noticed a luxury car pulling up to the workshop. The sleek black vehicle stood out starkly against the modest, everyday cars usually found there. A tall man in a well-tailored suit and pristine shoes stepped out from the driver's seat. He looked around as though surveying unfamiliar territory. Holding a briefcase under his arm, he walked purposefully toward Leslie, who immediately stood up to greet him. Wiping her hands on her oil-stained pants, she tried to compose herself. "Good morning. I'm looking for the owner of the workshop." "My name is Lincoln," he said, his voice calm and formal. Leslie couldn't help but notice his polite tone. an uncommon trait for someone arriving in an expensive car dressed like that. "My dad's in the office at the back," she replied, gesturing toward the rear. "Is something wrong?" Lincoln offered a faint smile, as if trying to reassure her. "I'm an attorney. I'm here to discuss some pending legal matters. I'd like to speak with him for a few minutes." Leslie pointed the way, her curiosity piqued. She watched as he walked away, noting the stark contrast between his immaculate suit and the grease-streaked floor of the workshop. A strange feeling nagged at her. Why was a lawyer here? And why hadn't her father mentioned it? Moments later, her father emerged from the office with Lincoln. They spoke quietly, but her father's expression remained the same, a mix of fear and shame. Lincoln, on the other hand, looked composed, his brow occasionally furrowing as if uncovering deeper problems than anticipated. As Lincoln departed, he briefly glanced at Leslie, seeming as though he wanted to say something. Instead, he handed her a business card. "If you need further assistance, feel free to reach out." "Sometimes, things are more complicated than they appear," he said before stepping into his car and driving away. Leslie tucked the card into her coverall pocket, unsure whether to trust or doubt him. She returned to her work, but her mind lingered on the interaction. Her father's behavior clearly indicated that the problem was enormous, perhaps more than just unpaid loans. At the end of the day, while closing up the workshop, rolling down the heavy metal doors, and gathering scattered tools, she overheard her father on the phone again. This time, his voice was barely audible. He sounded tense, and fragments of his conversation floated to her. "Calm down. I'll fix it. It's just a matter of time." Her heart raced. With every call, it felt like something terrible loomed closer. Later, alone in the workshop, Leslie sifted through the growing piles of documents on the desk. Overdue bills, bank delay notices, even court summonses she didn't recognize, all stacked like a mountain ready to collapse. Where had her father gotten so much borrowed money? And how could he be so confident everything was under control? One of the last customers to leave made a passing comment that unsettled her even more. "Good luck with the debts, miss. People are saying your dad made a deal with some special client. If it's what I think, I hope you're ready for it." The man's words left Leslie bewildered. What could this special client mean? Her mind swirled with questions she didn't dare ask aloud. She needed to talk to her father before it was too late. Shortly after, her father appeared at the door, looking troubled but forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. As she locked up the workshop, she approached him directly. "Dad, I need to know what's going on. Please, be honest with me. Are you involved with someone powerful? What's this special client people are talking about?" He hesitated, averting his gaze to the cracked asphalt of the sidewalk. "It's just a man who needs our services. He has money and can help us get out of this mess. But trust me, everything's under control." Leslie furrowed her brow. His words didn't match the defeated posture he had displayed for days. She knew under control was far from the truth. The rumors from the employees, Lincoln's visit, and, most of all, her father's distressed phone calls, none of it aligned with the idea of things being resolved. For Leslie, it was clear there was more to the story, something he wasn't telling her. Trembling with indignation and worry, she locked eyes with her father. "Dad, tell me what you really mean by everything's under control." He stepped back, avoiding her gaze, and took a deep breath, as if silence could suffice as an answer. That gesture only deepened the suspicions eating away at Leslie's heart. Something big and dark was happening, and she could feel it closing in. Leslie's face still burned with indignation when she woke up the next morning. Sleep had been elusive, her father's vague words echoing in her mind, feeding darker and darker suspicions. When she arrived at the workshop, she found him sitting on the same stool as always, his head buried in his hands. The suffocating tension in the air seemed to make everything worse. "I need to know what's going on," she demanded bluntly. Everything's under control." "Nonsense. Doesn't convince me. What did you promise that millionaire client?" Her father didn't look up. He remained motionless, as if battling something that weighed heavily on him. Suddenly, he lifted his head, his lips tightening with frustration. "You wouldn't understand," he said bitterly. "You have no idea what it's like to carry the weight of these debts, to see the workshop going under, to try and keep everything running. I understand more than you think, but I don't understand how you could get yourself into something so dangerous you won't even explain it to me." He stood abruptly, kicking a stray screw across the floor, the metallic clatter grating on her nerves. "I did what I thought I had to do to save this place," he shouted, his voice full of frustration. "No more questions, Leslie." His harsh tone cut deeply. Without another word, she walked away to a small tool room, a spot she often retreated to when she needed to be alone. That cubicle was her refuge, filled with childhood memories, the smell of oil that once made her feel safe, the sound of her father laughing as he taught her to use a screwdriver, the joy of successfully dismantling and reassembling her first engine. Now, it all felt tainted by a sense of betrayal. Leslie tried to collect her thoughts, but there wasn't much time for reflection. Footsteps echoed through the workshop. She peeked out and saw Lincoln approaching, a folder of documents in hand. He greeted her father with formality, but quickly picked up on the tense atmosphere. "I brought some papers that might help with part of the lawsuit against the workshop," he explained, holding up the folder. "I'd like to review them with you." Her father shrugged, showing little interest. Leslie, standing farther back, decided to approach to see what it was about. Lincoln greeted her with a slight smile, but soon frowned, noticing her troubled expression. "Is something wrong?" he asked gently. Leslie shrugged, unwilling to share what was happening, especially since she didn't yet fully understand how deep the problem went. Instead, she diverted the topic, saying they were just having a rough day. "If you need anything, I'm here," Lincoln said, his concern evident. The conversation was interrupted by one of the mechanics, a young man named Tiago, who made a comment Leslie hadn't heard so openly before. "So, it's true. There's going to be some fancy gathering here around New Year's. People say it's worth a fortune." Leslie's stomach turned. Her father paled. Realizing the tension, Tiago pretended to busy himself with some parts. Leslie stepped closer to confront her father, trying to keep her anger in check. "What is this? Have you been talking about some bizarre deal?" he stammered, his hesitation making everything worse. I just mentioned to an acquaintance that I'd found a way to pay off the debts." He started, but trailed off. Leslie couldn't contain her fury. "Oh, so it's true. You're actually considering selling me off for some New Year's meeting?" Her father was speechless. Lincoln, confused, tried to piece together what was happening. The heavy silence filled the room. Leslie, her heart racing, looked at her father as if he were a stranger. The man who had once been her hero now seemed capable of betraying her to clear his debts. "I had no choice," her father snapped, finding his voice again. "It's just a dinner or something. Nothing serious. He said he'd pay enough to save the workshop and cover our bills, Leslie." "Nothing serious?" she repeated, incredulous, her face flushing with rage. "You used me without even asking. How could you?" Leslie's voice rose, and soon she found herself openly arguing with her father. He ranted about the debts and lack of options, while she accused him of crossing every imaginable boundary. Lincoln looked between them, struggling to understand but recognizing the gravity of the situation. Unable to handle the pressure, Leslie stormed off. She retreated to a stockroom in the back, where dusty shelves were lined with old parts and boxes. The dim light from a high window barely illuminated the space. Leaning against a stack of tires, she felt the grimy texture of grease on her overalls and started to cry. She tried to muffle her sobs, but they came out in waves. Footsteps approached cautiously. It was Lincoln, his expression filled with concern. He stopped a few steps away, unsure whether to come closer. Sorry to intrude, but his voice was gentle. I saw how you left. Are you okay? Leslie quickly wiped her face, hating the idea of appearing weak in front of someone she barely knew. No, I'm not, but I can't tell you what's really happening. He hesitated, studying her trembling breaths, but didn't push further. That's fine. Just know, if you need anything, I'm willing to help. They exchanged a brief look. Leslie appreciated the gesture, but remained silent. At that moment, a loud crash echoed from the workshop. One of the mechanics had nearly toppled a toolbox, startling everyone. But worse was yet to come. The workshop phone rang. Her father answered, and within seconds, he began stammering, looking desperately at Leslie. She moved closer, catching fragments of the conversation. If you don't fulfill the deal, chaos will break loose. A chill ran down her spine. When her father hung up, his hands trembled so violently he had to grip the workbench to steady himself. Leslie demanded to know who it was, but he just shook his head, repeating, "Everything's under control. Everything's under control." Nothing about him reassured her. She turned to Giselle, a younger receptionist she trusted, for support. "This is getting out of hand," Leslie confided, sitting beside Giselle in the cramped office. "I overheard something about this meeting, and now threatening phone calls. I don't know how far this is going to go." Giselle tried to comfort her, insisting things would work out, but her anxious expression didn't inspire confidence. Leslie could tell that everyone in the workshop already sensed how dire the situation had become. Later, Lincoln returned with some documents, likely related to the lawsuit. He observed Leslie carefully and asked again if she was okay. She deflected, saying she didn't have time for more questions. Lincoln, clearly suspicious, simply left her with an extra contact number in case she wanted to talk. The day dragged on, the tension in the air almost tangible. No one dared speak openly about the Millionaire deal, but the topic loomed like a dark cloud. That evening, after everyone had left, Leslie stayed behind to organize tools and clean, hoping to clear her mind. As she wiped down a workbench, she heard a knock at the partly closed metal door. She froze, then went to see who it was. Outside, no one was there. Only a large, crumpled envelope slid under the door, her name scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. Opening it, Leslie found what she had feared most, a letter with the date and time of a New Year's meeting highlighted in bold letters, almost like a sinister invitation. At the bottom, an impeccable signature confirmed everything. The sender was none other than the Millionaire client. Leslie, alone in the workshop after hours, receives a letter detailing the time and place of the ominous New Year's meeting, signed by the Millionaire client. The morning chill seeped through the metal cracks of the workshop door as Leslie arrived, still shaken by the letter she had received the night before. Her thoughts swirled like a storm in her mind, keeping her from sleeping. Yet, she pressed on, determined to stick to her routine. She turned on the lights, checked the air compressor, and began organizing tools for the day's work. That's when she noticed something strange. The outside wall of the workshop, where they usually stacked used tires, was covered with menacing graffiti. Words painted in red sprawled across the metal and concrete, some so aggressive that Leslie felt her stomach churn. She also saw that some of the cars in the yard had been scratched, as if someone had come during the night with the sole intent to intimidate. A tightness gripped her chest. She ran inside and called for her father, who appeared with a look of sheer terror. When he saw the graffiti, he turned pale. Grabbing a bucket of water and a sponge, he tried to scrub the paint off, but his hands trembled so much that he only smeared the stains further. Leslie attempted to help him, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as though all those painted eyes on the walls were there to remind her that time was slipping away. A moment later, the sound of a car pulling up caught their attention. It was Lincoln, who stopped when he noticed the marks on the workshop's wall. He stepped out of his vehicle, eyebrows furrowed, and walked over to Leslie and her father. "What happened here?" he asked, perplexed, as he examined the scratches and slurs. Leslie took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "We don't know. It looks like someone came during the night." She trailed off, the simple description choking her. Her father, still scrubbing the wall with the bucket of water, turned his face toward Lincoln and attempted to say something, but no coherent words came out. Leslie realized he was avoiding direct eye contact with the lawyer, clearly afraid that the truth might surface. Lincoln pressed for more. "This isn't just random vandalism, is it? Are you being threatened?" Leslie stayed silent, glancing at her father, waiting for him to come clean. When he remained quiet, she took another deep breath and tried, "Dad, who are these people? Why would they do this to us?" Her father, visibly shaken, dropped the bucket, letting it tip over on the ground. "I'm not sure. All I know is that they demanded I hand over what was agreed upon, or the consequences would be worse." Leslie narrowed her eyes, unable to mask her anger. What kind of handover? Money? Something from the workshop? She had a sinking suspicion about the answer but needed to hear it. Her father simply shook his head, refusing to explain further. With every word he withheld, Leslie felt her worst fears becoming more real and painful. Lincoln watched the exchange with concern, sensing there was a much bigger story being concealed. Before he could intervene, a car stopped across the street, right by the main gate. From the car emerged a muscular man wearing a heavy jacket despite the mild weather, his sunglasses obscuring most of his face. He strode confidently as though he owned the place and began snapping photos of the workshop with his phone. "Hey! Can I help you?" Leslie shouted, still holding the paint-smeared sponge, trying to appear resolute. The man turned slowly, a faint smirk of mockery on his lips. "I'm here to check the premises. Need to make sure everything is in order. I represent the client your father owes some answers to." Leslie felt a chill run down her spine. For the first time, she was face to face with a direct envoy of the so-called powerful client. Unlike anonymous letters or phone calls, this was a flesh-and-blood figure, radiating an aura of real menace. "My father has nothing to say to you without a lawyer present," she shot back, trying to sound brave. The man chuckled darkly. "A lawyer. I see someone in a suit over there, but he doesn't scare me. I'm just here to ensure you fulfill your end of the deal." Then he took a decisive step toward the office. Sensing his intention to confiscate documents or cause damage, Leslie instinctively blocked the door. He stopped inches from her, his gaze daring her to move. "Step aside," he demanded, as though addressing an inanimate object. "I'm not letting you in," Leslie replied, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. The man raised his right arm as if to push her aside, but then Lincoln's voice rang out behind them. "Is there a problem here?" Lincoln approached calmly, though his stern expression made it clear he wouldn't allow anyone to steamroll Leslie. The muscular man assessed Lincoln with a sneer before pocketing his phone, adjusting his jacket, and stepping back. "No problem for now. Just don't make me come back, because next time I won't be so polite," he said, retreating to his car. "Remember, the clock's ticking, and nothing will stop me from collecting what's owed." After the man left, Leslie's legs wobbled. Lincoln placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, noticing her shaken state. "Are you okay?" he asked, concerned. "Don't face these people alone. We need to discuss what's going on." She hesitated, glancing at her father, who kept his eyes fixed on the ground. "I'm not sure I can say. This involves something he did without consulting me, but it affects me directly." Her father seemed to shrink under her words, consumed by shame. I signed some papers, Leslie, but I can't tell you more than that." Lincoln's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What papers? Do you have them? Can I see them?" Before her father could respond, Leslie's phone buzzed. She unlocked it and froze. The anonymous messages contained photos of her working at the shop, talking to Lincoln, and walking down the street, all taken from a distance, as though she were being stalked. The accompanying text was short and chilling. "Don't try to run. We're watching." Her father glanced at the screen and swallowed hard. Leslie nearly dropped the phone, overwhelmed by the violation of her privacy. "They're closing in on us," she murmured weakly. Later, as the morning gave way to the day's routine and a few mechanics arrived to start work, Leslie pulled Lincoln aside near a stack of tires. The sunlight streamed through the dust in the air, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. Carefully choosing her words, she began to explain, without mentioning the confrontation outright. "There's a powerful man pressuring my father. He owes him a lot of money, and it seems they agreed to some strange terms to secure the payment." Lincoln listened intently, nodding in understanding. "If you're being coerced, we might have a legal angle, but I need details." She tilted her head, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm still piecing it together, but thank you for offering to help. Just be careful. These people are dangerous." Lincoln nodded, his expression grim. "I'll see what I can find out about the debts. Maybe there's something irregular we can use against them. In the meantime, don't face them alone." Afterward, he stepped away to make calls, reaching out to contacts who might provide information on the debts or any legal cases tied to the workshop. Leslie stood for a moment, watching her father as he returned to work, his gaze never rising from the ground. She couldn't remember seeing him so defeated. He had, in essence, sold her out to someone, yet seemed powerless to escape the trap. By evening, exhausted from the long day, Leslie began gathering tools to close the shop. She didn't expect further trouble, but from a distance, she spotted the silhouette of the muscular man from earlier, sitting in a parked car, watching. Though he didn't approach, his posture was that of a predator biding his time. Her father, noticing the man's presence, broke into a cold sweat. Wiping his brow, he muttered to her, "We don't have another choice. If we don't do what they want, They'll ruin us completely." Leslie's heart raced as she recalled the anonymous messages and the man's intimidating stare. The countdown to the New Year's Eve delivery was ticking louder with each passing day. And with every moment, the invisible chains tightening around her grew heavier. As they finally locked up the shop and walked out, the parked car lingered, its driver watching their every move. Seconds later, the engine roared, and the car drove off, leaving behind the weight of its unspoken threats. When the stillness of the evening returned, Leslie couldn't shake the final warning the man had given earlier. His cold, deliberate words echoed in her mind. "If the delivery isn't made by New Year's, we'll destroy everything. Time's running out." The roar of a car engine speeding down the street echoed through the air, snapping Leslie out of a brief daydream as she cleaned a pair of tools in the workshop. It was still early, but her heart felt weary, as though she had been working non-stop for days. She had barely slept, haunted by thoughts of the looming due date. She still clung to hope that the worst could be avoided, but with each passing day, the shadow of the millionaire client only seemed to grow. Hearing footsteps behind her, she turned to find her father. His expression somber, a mix of guilt and despair clouding his face. He approached her, holding out a crumpled piece of paper with frayed edges. "It came early this morning. They left it at the gate," he murmured, avoiding her gaze. Leslie took the paper and unfolded it. Written were just 2 short sentences that left no doubt about the sender's power. "I expect you on New Year's. If you try to run, there will be consequences." She could almost hear the cold, calculated tone of the writer. She had to fight the urge to crumple the note and toss it aside. "I can't believe you still think this is under control, Dad," she said, handing the note back to him. He lowered his head, trembling. "I just want to save the workshop. And you, too. But there's no way out now." His words felt like a confession of defeat. Leslie wanted to scream, but chose instead to take a deep breath. They were well past the point of emotional outbursts. She returned to organizing the tools on the bench, silently wishing that Lincoln would show up with good news. As if summoned by her thoughts, Lincoln pulled up in his car, parking directly in front of the workshop entrance. He stepped out with a serious air, a folder of documents in hand. He greeted both father and daughter with a curt nod before walking in, surveying the space around him. "I spoke with some colleagues. There are even more debts than I thought, most of them quite old and in the workshop's name." "You've been in financial trouble for a while, haven't you?" he asked. Leslie's father nodded, fidgeting with his fingers, unable to meet Lincoln's gaze. Leslie's heart sank seeing her father so defeated, but she was also relieved that someone was finally untangling the mess he had created. "Is there any chance we could get an extension or some breathing room?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope. Lincoln rubbed his chin, flipping through the papers. "It won't be easy. The creditor is powerful, and the amount owed is significant. Regardless, I need to know everything. No secrets. We need to understand who we're dealing with." Leslie hesitated, looking at her father, hoping he would speak up. But he only shook his head, muttering something unintelligible, unwilling to explain the ominous meeting. Without the full story, Lincoln couldn't file any claims for coercion or extortion. Frustrated, Leslie wanted to force the truth out of him but held back, fearing it would only worsen his fragile state. The workshop was unusually quiet that day. Many employees had left early, scared off by recent threats and vandalism. Leslie and her father tried to keep the work going with the little energy they had left, while Lincoln, seated on an improvised chair, alternated between phone calls and sifting through documents. The noise from outside, buses screeching to a halt, motorcycles zipping by, contrasted sharply with the tense atmosphere inside. At one point, Leslie stepped out to grab some food from a nearby diner. On her way, she noticed the suspicious stares from neighbors who seemed to have heard rumors about her father. Whispered remarks reached her ears. "That's the girl, the mechanic's daughter who got in trouble." She felt the weight of judgment from all sides, as though she were carrying a guilt that wasn't hers. When she returned, she found Lincoln in the yard, inspecting a semi-new car with engine issues. Though he tried to mask his curiosity, he couldn't resist asking, "Leslie, I need to know, what kind of deal did your father make with this millionaire client? Yesterday, you hinted at something odd but didn't elaborate. These threats and collectors aren't typical of regular commercial debt." She bit her lip, unsure if she should disclose the truth. She began, but her words were cut off by the sound of screeching tires outside the workshop. Instinctively, she moved to the gate to see who had arrived. It was the same sleek car she had seen before, with the same muscular figure behind the wheel. He stepped out and, without ceremony, handed an envelope to Leslie's father. He didn't enter or say anything beyond a curt, "See you soon." Then he drove off, leaving only the smell of burning tires in his wake. Leslie's father opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter confirming the date of the New Year's meeting and the exact amount to be settled if the terms were met. Leslie caught a glimpse of the number and nearly choked. It was enough money to clear all the workshop's debts, but also enough to buy the dignity of someone left with no options. "Do you understand now?" her father murmured, his eyes cast downward. "We can't pay this. It's either we go through with the meeting, or we lose everything." A chill ran down Leslie's spine. Lincoln, intrigued, stepped closer but remained in the dark about the specifics. Leslie realized that if she didn't open up, they would keep going in circles. She clenched her grease-stained hands, summoning courage, and nodded almost tearfully. "Dad, he needs to know the truth. Otherwise, how will we get out of this?" Her father looked at Lincoln, blinking several times, as if ready to confess. "It's a meeting. A meeting this man wants, specifically with my daughter. He promises to pay all the money if Leslie attends this dinner on New Year's and meets his demands." His voice was muffled, as if this was the first time he had spoken the words aloud. Leslie averted her eyes, ashamed but curious about Lincoln's reaction. He stared in shock, turning to Leslie with disbelief. "What do you mean, a meeting? Are you saying he's buying her?" No one answered. The guilt and shame on her father's face filled the empty workshop, and Lincoln finally understood the gravity of the situation. The day dragged on heavily. Leslie tried to focus on repairing an old car while her father locked himself in the office, unable to face her. Lincoln delved deeper into the debt paperwork, making phone calls. He mentioned terms like extortion and coercion, suggesting legal action, but also warned that the powerful creditor could complicate things. "If we can prove you were coerced into this, we could void everything. But the courts are slow, and he'll do whatever it takes to block us," Lincoln explained, scratching his head in frustration. Leslie dropped her tools, wiping her hands on a grimy rag. "So our only option is to wait for justice to act. But the deadline is approaching. He said if I don't show up for the meeting, he'll destroy the workshop completely and ruin my father." She took a deep breath. "I don't want anyone else to suffer because of me." Lincoln stepped closer, his gaze filled with empathy. "You're not to blame. You're a victim of an absurd situation. Please, don't carry this guilt." His understanding gave Leslie a flicker of comfort. Having someone who recognized the injustice and offered help made things slightly more bearable. Yet part of her couldn't accept the idea of being sold without her consent. The knot in her stomach remained. As the day came to an end, father and daughter were left alone in the workshop. Trembling, he apologized to her but insisted he saw no way out other than to accept the meeting. He believed it was their only option to avoid complete ruin. "I don't want you to go through this humiliation," he whispered, tears glistening in his eyes. "But I don't know what else to do." Leslie, conflicted, hugged her father, though her heart ached with resentment. She understood his weakness, but couldn't forgive him so easily. They stood there, motionless, as the fading sunlight seemed to carry away all hope. Lincoln reappeared at the end, gathering his documents before leaving. He gave Leslie a final reassuring glance, as if to say, "Don't give up. We still have a chance." She returned a faint nod, trying to believe him. Later, an oppressive silence filled the space. Leslie cleaned the remaining tools on the bench and looked around, feeling the shadow of the millionaire client lingering everywhere. Though he had never shown up in person, his power permeated every bolt, every piece of metal, every dream she and her father had for the workshop. As she closed the metal doors, she remembered how much she loved this place, the smell of oil, the smoke of engines, the clatter of tools. It was all part of who she was, but now every sound and scent felt tainted by the presence of an unseen enemy. And then, her father, standing dejectedly beside her, dropped the bombshell. Leslie opens the folder and sees the contract selling her company for New Year's, with her forged signature. Leslie couldn't tear her eyes away from the paper in her hands. The contract seemed to scream every word, and at the bottom of the last page was her signature, or something pretending to be her signature. The letters were crafted to resemble hers, but it felt like a crude forgery. There was no room left for denial. She had truly been sold, without even knowing. You forged my signature." Leslie's voice trembled, betraying the anger and pain coursing through her. Her father, pale as a ghost, clasped his hands together, pleading for a kind of understanding he didn't feel worthy to ask for. "Leslie, listen to me. I didn't want it to come to this. I had to save the shop, and I never imagined it would spiral out of control like this." She raised her gaze, her eyes burning with a volatile mix of disbelief and disgust. "So, you thought you had the right to sign for me? To push me into something without even asking?" With each word, she felt her face grow hotter, her breathing more labored. "I've spent my life trying to help here, cleaning up your messes, but this is too much." Her father tried to defend himself, but the guilt weighed too heavily on his shoulders for him to form any plausible justification. He swallowed hard, his palms sweating. I thought it was just a dinner." "He promised me money, a lot of money, enough to fix everything." "Fix everything? At my expense?" Leslie stepped back, clutching the contract tightly. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't fight back?" He made a move toward her, but stopped when he saw the fury in her eyes. At that moment, the workshop door swung open, letting in a gust of air and the echoing sound of footsteps on the concrete floor. It was Lincoln, drawn by the raised voices he'd heard outside. "Is something wrong?" he asked, surveying the tense scene. Leslie opened her mouth but said nothing. Her father, however, let slip the confession he had been avoiding. "I signed a contract that forces Leslie to meet someone." Lincoln stared, stunned. "Excuse me, what? A meeting?" Her father, his face etched with shame, pressed a hand to his forehead. "I thought it wasn't serious, just a New Year's dinner. But now I realize this man wants much more, and the debts are enormous." Lincoln turned to Leslie, his disbelief plain. "He's forcing you to meet a client on New Year's to cover debts." Still trembling with anger, she nodded. "And my father forged my signature." "My God!" Lincoln's outrage was palpable. "This is completely illegal. If there's coercion or extortion, we can fight this." But Leslie's father sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I'm out of options. They have leverage, evidence of my debts. I'll lose the shop and everything I own." He slumped. "I never thought it would go this far. I just wanted to pay it all off." Leslie was about to retort when a noise from outside made her heart race. Suddenly, the door opened again and two men entered. She recognized them instantly as enforcers working for the so-called millionaire client. Their expressions were grim, and one carried an old ledger, like a record of overdue payments. "Well," growled one of them, without preamble, "we're here to confirm if you'll honor the agreement or pay up now." Leslie's father straightened his back but was paralyzed. Leslie and Lincoln exchanged tense glances. A chilling silence fell over the workshop before the taller enforcer spoke again. "You're past the deadline. If you don't have the full amount, you'll fulfill the deal. It's that simple." "We're not letting you drag this debt out," added the other with a cold smile. "And if she refuses—" He didn't need to finish the threat. Leslie felt a surge of anger. "We don't have the money. And we won't let you destroy what little we have left." The enforcer laughed, a harsh sound, and brushed against a nearby shelf, knocking down some heavy tools. The crash echoed through the space, like an omen of chaos. Lincoln moved quickly, positioning himself near Leslie, while her father raised his hands in a shaky attempt to de-escalate the situation. "Wait, there's no need for this," her father pleaded, his voice trembling. "Next time we're here, it won't just be tools hitting the floor," threatened the taller man, glaring directly at Leslie as if to intimidate her. "You'll either meet your end of the deal or pay dearly for it." After a few more moments of oppressive tension, the two men left, warning they'd return soon to ensure compliance. Leslie's father collapsed onto a bench, his face slick with sweat and shame. Lincoln, still breathing heavily, let out a muffled curse. "That was too close," Leslie muttered, picking up the fallen tools. She felt dirty, violated, as though the workshop itself had been desecrated. She then noticed her father trembling uncontrollably, his expression broken. He seemed reduced to a man stripped of all strength and dignity. Leslie closed her eyes, fighting back tears, but all she could think about was how deeply they had sunk into this spiral of debts and threats. Without a word, she retreated to the back of the workshop, a rarely visited area. Leaning against a cold wall, she slid down to the floor, hugging her knees as the tears finally fell. She felt humiliated, betrayed by her own father, and cornered by strangers who treated her as nothing more than a prize to be claimed. To her surprise, Lincoln appeared silently, sitting beside her. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea things were this bad." Leslie looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "He put the shop above me, and now we're all going to lose. One way or another." Instead of offering empty words of comfort, Lincoln rested a hand on her shoulder. You didn't ask for this. You're a victim, and I'm going to do everything I can to change this outcome." She was taken aback by his resolve. It felt as though, for the first time, someone was willing to stand by her side, not out of pity, but out of a genuine sense of justice. Overwhelmed, she let herself cry. Lincoln didn't try to stop her or judge her. He simply stayed, giving her space to release the pain she'd been carrying. After a few moments, Leslie took a deep breath, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Thank you. Seriously. You didn't have to be here, and yet you are." He gave her a sad smile. "It's not about obligation. It's about doing what's right. What they're doing to you is unacceptable." For the first time, Leslie felt a flicker of something resembling warmth. It was comforting to know that even in this storm, there was someone she could trust. For a fleeting moment, the tension eased, allowing her to see Lincoln for what he was, a principled man who genuinely cared. With her breathing steadier, she stood and returned to the main area. They found her father still sitting on the bench, his head bowed, looking like someone utterly defeated by life. In a faint voice, he confessed, "I'm in this mess because I gambled the shop away. I lost, the debts piled up, and agreeing to the deal was the only way I could think to cover it all." Leslie heard his confession without shock, only a heavier weight pressing on her chest. "So it was gambling. You risked the little we had left." Her father didn't defend himself. He only muttered another apology. Everything now made sense. The towering debts, the threats, the desperation. Leslie crossed her arms, her mind racing. If she refused the meeting, they'd lose everything. But if she agreed, she'd feel as though she'd been sold for a price that humiliated her deeply. Lincoln, looking between them, finally spoke. "I'll help you. We'll try to nullify this contract, prove the signature was forged, and that coercion was involved. It won't be easy, but there's hope." Leslie stared at him, unsure what to say. Half of her wanted to throw her arms around him in gratitude for offering a lifeline. The other half doubted they could ever overcome a man so rich and powerful. Then Lincoln extended his hand to her, his voice low but filled with determination. "We'll find a way to bring this contract down. Trust me." Leslie looked at his hand, then into his resolute face, inviting her to believe. Her heart wavered between hope and fear, unsure if escape from what seemed inevitable was truly possible. Leslie opened the workshop that morning with her body tense and her mind racing. Lincoln's promise to overturn that unfair contract had sparked a small glimmer of hope, but it wasn't enough to dispel the fear throbbing in her chest. The weight of the impending New Year's meeting still loomed over her, growing closer each day like a blade hanging above her head. Her father arrived shortly after, his steps slow and his gaze weary. He could barely look his daughter in the eye since admitting he had forged her signature. Still, he seemingly tried to maintain a normal work routine, settling at a workbench and cleaning engine parts. However, the silence between them spoke louder than any argument ever could. Not long after, Lincoln arrived, parking his car with his phone already pressed to his ear. He gave Leslie a brief nod as he finished his call. "I'm trying to schedule a handwriting analysis to prove the signature is forged," he explained, slipping his phone into his pocket. "But these processes take time and cost money." Leslie sighed in frustration. "We don't have much time, and money is something we're short on too." Still, Lincoln seemed resolute. "I'll keep searching for legal loopholes. There might be a way out. But if this man has connections with powerful people, it complicates things." He glanced at Leslie's father, who remained silent. "We need every detail about the debts, down to the last cent. Any documents showing coercion, written threats, or recordings we can use." Her father sighed deeply, continuing to wipe a grimy rag over a motor casing. "I have a few old gambling receipts, some debt collection letters, but nothing that directly incriminates the wealthy client. He's smart, doesn't leave easy traces." Leslie began rummaging through drawers and dusty boxes, hoping to find something that could serve as evidence. All she uncovered were old invoices, notes on part prices, and finalized service contracts. None of it seemed remotely useful for filing a case against someone so powerful. No matter how hard she tried, the feeling of helplessness consumed her, like swimming against a strong current. Even as she attended to a customer picking up their car, her mind was elsewhere, trapped in the uncertainty of her future. After sending the customer off, Leslie stepped outside to get some fresh air. She needed a moment to clear her thoughts. Outside, the sun beat down uncomfortably on the asphalt. Then she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. A man she didn't recognize was standing across the street, apparently reading a magazine but glancing toward the workshop repeatedly. Leslie took a few steps closer, trying to get a better look, and realized he was indeed watching her. The moment he noticed her attention, he turned and walked away, disappearing around a corner. "They're watching us," she thought, swallowing hard. The wealthy client's enforcers seemed to have eyes everywhere, reinforcing the notion that escape was nearly impossible. When she returned inside, she found Lincoln on the phone again, speaking urgently. "I understand, but we need some kind of temporary injunction. Anything to protect us for now." He paused to listen. "Got it? Thanks for your help." Hanging up, Lincoln rubbed his face with his hands, looking tired and frustrated. "Any news?" Leslie ventured to ask. "Nothing good," he replied, sighing. "My contacts say the wealthy client has a reputation for bribing local authorities. It's not a new rumor. Everyone knows, but no one can prove it. That makes it harder to act quickly through legal channels." She clenched her fists, trying to suppress her anger. "So not even the police can help us?" Lincoln shook his head. "It's harsh to put it this way, but if he has enough influence, he can delay investigations, silence people. The only way is to gather solid evidence that you were coerced and that the signature is fake. But these cases take months, even years, depending on the circumstances." Leslie felt her knees weaken, remembering that the New Year's meeting was less than a month away. "Then, we won't have enough time," she concluded, her voice faltering for a moment. Behind a stack of tires, her father began sorting through more papers, but it was clear he wouldn't find anything useful. His expression reflected regret, but he seemed powerless to undo the damage he had caused. Leslie stared at him, hoping for a miraculous suggestion, but all he offered was a brief, ashamed look. The next day, Leslie tried to scrape together some money from the services rendered. She attended to simple tasks like oil changes and inspections, but every payment she received felt insignificant compared to the massive debt looming over them. In desperation, she called old business partners, asking if anyone could advance payments or at least recommend more clients. The answer was always the same: "Sorry, I can't help." As the hours dragged on, her anxiety became almost unbearable. She spent most of the time looking over her shoulder, fearing that an enforcer might show up unannounced. She needed to keep her composure, but she couldn't shake the bitter taste in her mouth when she thought about how her father had effectively sold her to someone. Around mid-afternoon, Lincoln received a phone call and, upon finishing it, called Leslie and her father for a private conversation in the makeshift back office. His expression was serious, but there was a faint glimmer of hope. "I managed to speak with a former employee of the wealthy client," Lincoln said, keeping his voice low. "He claims there are incriminating documents, evidence of fraud, bribery, and even threats involving this man, but he says it's highly risky." Leslie's heart raced. "Incriminating documents? Then this could be our way out of the contract." Lincoln nodded cautiously. "Maybe, but the former employee doesn't want to come forward publicly. He's afraid of retaliation. He said he might be able to find some proof, but he's not willing to take too many risks. And he doesn't know how to get it to us without being discovered." Leslie's father shook his head, as if he couldn't believe they had reached this point, having to rely on a secret informant to bring down a powerful man. But they had no choice, as the normal avenues were blocked. The following days were filled with tension. Leslie barely slept, haunted by the fear of an attack at any moment. The workshop operated at a slow pace, nearly grinding to a halt, as many employees requested leave, fearing conflicts and threats. Yet Leslie and her father pressed on, keeping the place clean, serving whoever showed up, and avoiding conversations about the ordeal consuming their thoughts. Meanwhile, Lincoln dug deeper into the former employee's background. Each time he learned something new, he rushed to the workshop to update Leslie. It seemed that with every piece of information they obtained, the mission to expose the wealthy client grew more dangerous. The man had friends in high places and didn't hesitate to pay to keep everything quiet. One day, Leslie tried speaking to a childhood friend who was now a police officer, hoping he could open an investigation. However, he became hesitant upon hearing the client's name. "I'm sorry, but I can't do anything without solid evidence. And even if I had it, I don't know how long it would take. Be careful, Leslie. This man is dangerous." She left the station with slumped shoulders, feeling as though every door was closing before her eyes. When she returned to the workshop, she found her father buried in archive boxes, rummaging through old files as if desperately searching for salvation. I just remembered there might be some record of threats from months ago," he said, blowing dust off a stack of documents. "It was when those people first started coming after us. Maybe there's something useful, a letter or an email." "Let's hope we find something," Leslie replied, joining him in sorting through the papers. Despite her anger, she couldn't ignore how her father seemed increasingly remorseful with each passing day. They spent hours flipping through yellowed pages, expired contracts, and newspaper clippings. Nothing surfaced that directly incriminated the wealthy client. Their frustration only grew, and Leslie began to think it truly was a losing battle. Near nightfall, Lincoln showed up unexpectedly, bringing coffee for them. The warm aroma filled the office, but no one had the spirit to truly enjoy it. He sat beside Leslie, observing the scattered paperwork. "Don't torture yourself, Leslie. It's clear this man knows how to cover his tracks," Lincoln said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But we won't give up." She was about to respond when Lincoln's phone rang sharply. He answered and, upon hearing the voice on the other end, tensed. "Really? Okay. Where?" he asked, standing and glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "All right. Leslie and I can meet you there." Leslie frowned, anxiously waiting for him to end the call. After hanging up, Lincoln spoke with a breathless urgency. "I just got a call from someone who claims to have evidence against the wealthy client. They've scheduled a meeting for tomorrow." The sun was barely rising on the horizon when Leslie and Lincoln got into the car, still shaken by the mysterious call they'd received the night before. The voice of the former employee of the millionaire client had trembled with fear, but he seemed willing to help, offering valuable evidence against the powerful man. The meeting was set in a desolate area, a cluster of abandoned warehouses outside the city, and Leslie felt a tightening in her chest, just imagining all that could go wrong. Yet, it was their only real chance to overturn that absurd contract. The journey felt longer with each passing mile as the roads grew narrower and lonelier. The desolate surroundings, filled with graffiti-covered concrete structures and vacant lots, amplified the tension. Leslie kept her gaze fixed on the window, fighting to steady her nerves. Lincoln, driving cautiously, showed the same anxiety despite trying to appear composed. "I thought this former employee would be too scared to meet in person," Leslie remarked, attempting to fill the heavy silence in the car. "He is scared," Lincoln replied in a low voice, "but he said he's tired of running. He thinks that by cooperating, he might ease his guilt a little." Leslie nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and apprehension. No one would dare go against the millionaire client without a compelling reason. She just hoped this man wasn't setting them up for a trap. 15 minutes later, they parked in front of a dilapidated warehouse with walls riddled with cracks. It appeared to have been some kind of factory long since abandoned. Everything was silent except for the distant sound of a broken pipe, dripping water. The wind stirred wires and discarded cans, creating an eerie metallic hiss. "This is the place," Lincoln murmured, double-checking the message on his phone. They stepped out and walked toward a partially open metal door. Inside, the dim light barely illuminated the space, with only faint rays slipping through cracks in the roof. Leslie quickened her pace, her shoes echoing against the concrete floor, until she spotted a man leaning against an oil-stained wall. He wore a worn cap and kept his head low as if still afraid of being recognized. "Are you Leslie's friends?" he asked, adjusting the cap to see them better. "Yes," Lincoln confirmed, offering no further details. "Do you have something to show us?" The man stepped forward, pulling a plastic folder from the oversized pocket of his jacket. His eyes darted nervously, as though he expected to be watched. He held up the folder for them to see. "This is just a sample of digital and printed documents proving illegal deals, embezzlement, bribes, all involving your boss." Leslie's heart raced. This could be the break they desperately needed. "Why are you giving this to us?" she ventured. "You know you could get into serious trouble, too." The man shrugged with a bitter laugh. "I'm already neck-deep in trouble. I've seen too much behind the scenes. I'm complicit by staying silent. But I can't keep quiet while he ruins lives. I've heard rumors that he's forcing you into something outrageous. Maybe these documents will help you fight back." Lincoln stepped forward to take the folder, but before he could grab it, hurried footsteps echoed behind a stack of crates. Suddenly, 2 men appeared, cutting the moment short. Leslie instantly recognized their muscular build and menacing demeanor. They were enforcers for the millionaire client. The former employee paled on the spot. "Handing over things that don't belong to you, huh?" One of the men sneered, striding forward with purpose. "You're pretty naive if you think you can steal documents and walk away unscathed." Leslie and Lincoln exchanged worried glances. They hadn't anticipated being ambushed so soon. The man who had promised them evidence began backing away, trembling as though facing an inescapable nightmare. "Run!" he shouted, tossing the folder to Lincoln. Papers scattered into the air like autumn leaves. In a split second, the enforcers lunged at Lincoln and Leslie. She managed to dodge, grabbing a few flying sheets. Lincoln, meanwhile, collided with one of the men, trying to hold him off to buy Leslie time to collect the documents. "Get the papers and go!" Lincoln shouted, gritting his teeth as he was shoved against an iron beam. The former employee, now cornered, sprinted to a dark corner, panting heavily, while Leslie gathered as many papers as her trembling hands could hold. Her chest tightened, fear for Lincoln surging within her. One of the enforcers charged at her, but she ducked, feeling the whoosh of his strike close to her face. In the background, a loud clang echoed, not a gunshot, but a metal rod knocked to the ground, rolling noisily. The sound seemed to terrify the former employee even more as he cowered in the shadows. Lincoln used the distraction to shove his attacker aside, trying to reach Leslie. "Leslie, let's go!" he yelled, keeping her in sight. She clutched the now crumpled folder, with a few pages tucked inside, and dashed toward a rusty side door. Her heart pounded as if every beat heralded disaster. When Lincoln broke free from the skirmish, he ran after her. They burst through the door with a resounding crash, emerging into the back lot of the warehouse. Two skinny dogs scavenging through trash yelped and bolted at the commotion. Leslie and Lincoln didn't stop to catch their breath. They kept running, heading for a low wall separating the property from an empty street. Climbing over it was arduous. They dirtied their clothes with dust and grime, landing on the other side with aching knees. "Are you okay?" Leslie asked, struggling to stand. "I think—" "So," Lincoln panted, trying to steady himself. "Did you grab the documents?" Leslie held up the battered folder, a few crumpled pages dangling out. It was clear many others had been lost in the chaos. Most of it got left behind. I managed to save a fraction. They looked at each other, lungs burning from the run and hearts pounding like war drums. There was no time to dwell on what they'd lost. They needed to leave before the enforcers regrouped or called for reinforcements. "Let's get to the car," Leslie urged, wiping sweat from her brow. They circled the block until they reached their vehicle. The desolate place, once merely derelict, now carried the weight of a tense confrontation. They climbed in and sped away, merging onto the main road without a word until they felt safely distant. Only then did Lincoln break the silence, still catching his breath. "We need to check what's in those papers. And then, God, what if those men are following us?" Leslie checked the rearview mirror, half expecting a suspicious car. All she saw were empty roads. "We have to act quickly, and we need to find out if the former employee is okay." He stayed back. "I fear he might be in serious danger for giving us these documents," Lincoln said grimly, running a hand through his hair. But there was no other way. He knew the risks. Leslie's stomach churned with guilt and worry. She wanted to go back and help, but the fear of another ambush loomed too large. If they were caught again, everything would be lost. She decided to press forward, determined to salvage the small piece of evidence they'd secured. Back at the shop, Leslie's father nearly had a heart attack when they stumbled in, disheveled and dirty. "What on earth happened? Are you crazy meeting someone in a place like that?" Leslie, still catching her breath, set the folder on the workbench. "We needed the evidence. Things got messy. We were ambushed. But we managed to grab some of it." Her father stared at the crumpled papers, some smudged and illegible, shaking his head. "My God, I've put you in this horrible situation. I never meant for this to happen." She placed a reassuring hand on his arm, cutting off his regret. "It's too late to dwell on that now. Let's focus on what we have and act fast." Lincoln began sorting through the documents, deciphering what was legible and pulling out relevant information. There were mentions of bribes and suspicious financial transactions, not much, but enough to start building a case against the millionaire client. Meanwhile, Leslie spoke in hushed tones, her ears straining for any sounds outside that might signal incoming trouble. But before they could delve deeper, the shop phone rang sharply, startling them. Leslie answered, and a deep voice spoke on the other end without introduction. "You think you can mess with me and get away? I heard about your little stunt today." Leslie recognized the voice immediately. It was the same enforcer who had threatened her before. Her stomach churned as she gripped the phone tightly. He spoke slowly, each word heavy with menace. "Don't think this ends here. If you try to incriminate me, think twice. I have influence in places you can't imagine, and the New Year's meeting is still on. I suggest you honor your part, or there won't be a shop left for you to fix anything ever again." The silence that followed was deafening. Leslie hung up with trembling hands, her face pale with terror. Lincoln and her father moved closer, their concern evident, but it took her several seconds to find her voice. When she finally spoke, it was barely audible. It might be impossible to escape this. The first thing Leslie felt upon opening her eyes that morning was the weight of everything that was about to happen. The new year was fast approaching, and even the few leads she and Lincoln had managed to uncover seemed insufficient to nullify the contract that bound her to a humiliating meeting. With every heartbeat, she heard the echo of threats, a reminder that there would be no respite if she didn't show up on the designated date. Arriving at the garage, she found her father sitting in a corner, his back against a wall stained with grease. His eyes were vacant, devoid of light. He looked older than ever, worn down by his own choices and the turns life had taken. Leslie felt a pang of pity, but couldn't bring herself to forgive him for having sold her. She stopped a few steps away, hesitating to say anything. "I didn't sleep at all," he murmured, without raising his face. "I keep thinking about how the debts only got worse. And everything I did to try to pay them off." Leslie rested a hand on a nearby workbench, noting the scattered tools as if no one had the energy to put them back in place. "Dad, the informant who risked everything to get us those documents, has disappeared. Lincoln and I can't reach him. We don't have enough evidence to take that man down. And the new year is almost here." He raised his head slightly, and she could see his reddened eyes. "Do you think there's another way out?" he asked softly, almost whispering. "I'm so sorry, Leslie. I hate myself for getting us to this point, but I don't see a better option than accepting it." She shook her head, turning her gaze away so he wouldn't see the tears threatening to surface. "Do you even put yourself in my shoes? Do you understand what it's like to give yourself up like this?" He lowered his head again, as if he lacked the strength to respond. It was obvious he felt tormented, yet resigned to his own cowardice. Leslie swallowed hard, feeling a wave of anger surge. She needed to get away, at least for a few minutes, to avoid exploding. Outside, the weak end-of-year sun lit the sidewalk. A few customers hurried by, but most of the garage workers were gone. Many had taken leave or simply disappeared, fearing that a heavy confrontation might erupt at any moment. Leslie walked to the corner, where a stand sold coffee and snacks, but she realized she didn't have the appetite for even a simple roll. That's when she heard a familiar voice. Lincoln was approaching, his expression worried. "I tried to file a formal coercion complaint, but it didn't go anywhere. The authorities are asking for more evidence, and the process is dragging. My contacts say there's not much to be done without solid proof. Leslie gave him a disheartened look, crossing her arms over her chest. It feels like we're fighting a brick wall. No matter what we do, he manages to block everything. And now the informant is gone. Lincoln nodded, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Everyone we try to involve backs out, some out of fear, others because they've been bought off. He's too influential. She looked around, observing the movement of cars and the sun beginning to warm the asphalt. It was hard to believe that amidst the banal routine of the streets, a personal tragedy was about to unfold. Lincoln, I don't know what else to do. If I refuse to go, my father loses everything, and the garage turns to dust. Maybe it's better to just get it over with. He frowned, visibly agitated. Don't say that. We can still try something. Accepting this absurdity would be letting him win. You don't deserve to go through this kind of humiliation. Leslie took a deep breath, fighting against her emotions. As much as she wanted to resist, she felt her strength waning, like a rope stretched to its limit. No one could find a solution, and time was racing. The new year is almost here, Lincoln. All we have so far are incomplete documents, threats from all sides, and a regretful father who can't fix anything. They returned to the garage together, finding Leslie's father attempting to organize tools but lacking any focus. When he saw them enter, he dropped everything to the floor, the metal pieces clattering loudly. "I'm sorry. I'm useless," he said, his voice breaking. "All I've brought is suffering and fear to my own daughter." Lincoln took a couple of steps toward him but wasn't sure what to say. Leslie remained silent, afraid of saying something that would hurt him further. After all, part of her still remembered that this man was her father, the person who once taught her how to fix engines and loved the smell of grease. But now everything felt twisted and bitter. In the hours that followed, Lincoln made more calls, went to the police station, and spoke with a close contact at the courthouse. But all the answers were vague. They needed reports, forensic analysis, and witnesses to confirm the forged signature and threats, things that simply weren't appearing. Leslie listened to every call, her heart in her throat, hoping for something that would light her path. Nothing happened. By nightfall, despair set in. Leslie locked the garage with her father, who could barely lift his head. They walked side by side in silence to the main street, where they would part ways. He headed to the home they had always shared. She, on the other hand, needed air, distance, anything to help her think. She walked alone for several blocks, aimlessly. When she finally looked around, she found herself in front of an almost empty park. There was a wooden bench near an artificial pond. She sat there, resting her face in her hands, replaying every threat and panic-filled scene from the past days. The collector's face, the intimidating notes, the folder with insufficient documents, and her father's admission that he had indeed sold her in a contract haunted her thoughts. It was so infuriating that she lightly punched her knee, as if trying to stop thinking. She didn't know how long she had been there, but the evening breeze was growing colder. Then she heard light footsteps behind her. Looking up, she was surprised to see Lincoln again, breathless as if he had run across the entire city to find her. "I've been looking for you," he said, his concern genuine. "You disappeared, and your father didn't know where you were. He's worried." She forced a tired smile. "I just needed to be alone for a while." He sat beside her, absorbing the tense calm of the place. "I know you're confused. So am I. But I won't give up trying to find a way." Leslie felt a pang of gratitude, though the sense of a dead end remained. She told Lincoln about her bitter conversation with her father and how everything felt hopeless. He listened in silence, clenching his hands as if trying to contain his own anger at the situation. When the wind grew colder, they both stood and walked together to the main street. Lincoln accompanied her to her doorstep, where her father was waiting, sitting on the sidewalk. The scene was desolate. The man's vacant stare, grease-stained hands barely washed, holding a bundle of endless bills. "I'm sorry, Leslie," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what else to say." She approached him, placing a hand on his trembling shoulder in a gesture that mixed affection and pain. Lincoln stayed close, but didn't interfere. They needed a family moment, even if it was one of ruin. "Dad, look at me," she said. He lifted his gaze, his eyes wet. "I see you're sorry, but the millionaire client doesn't care. He just wants to use me as a bargaining chip." He said nothing, clutching the bills to his chest as if they were a sentinel of guilt. Finally, he let out a long sigh. "If I could turn back time, I swear I would. But now, I don't see another way. And I can't bear to see you humiliated." Before tears overwhelmed him, Leslie swallowed hard and turned to Lincoln, who was watching her silently but with the same supportive, determined expression as always. She realized that his goodwill wouldn't be enough against such overwhelming power. Reality was harsher than she had imagined. Only then did Leslie make the decision that had been tormenting her for days. Feeling her entire body go limp, she turned to Lincoln and spoke the words that seemed to cut through the air. I have to go. It's the only way to save everything." The sky was heavy, laden with gray clouds, as Leslie awoke that morning. Only a few hours remained until New Year's, and the decision she had dreaded for so long had become unavoidable. She would meet with the wealthy client, a last-ditch effort to save her father from losing the auto shop and sinking further into insurmountable debt. Her heart pounded like a frightened drum, but there was no room left for hesitation. She got up and silently wandered through the house until she reached the small kitchen. She sat down in front of a lukewarm cup of coffee her father had left on the table, unable to face her. The night before, Leslie had made it clear that she would agree to the meeting, and the guilt etched in his eyes was unbearable. Even so, he appeared in the hallway, attempting to voice an extended apology, but faltering after a few hesitant words. "Daughter, if I could go back," he began, his voice hoarse and almost choked. "I know," Leslie replied without much emotion, "and I don't expect you to fix everything anymore." He shook his head, his shoulders slumping. "I wish I could give you some guarantee that nothing bad will happen. But I don't even know if I can promise that." Leslie felt a lump in her throat. "Just leave me alone for a few minutes. We'll talk later, okay?" She gestured lightly toward the door, and he walked away, his footsteps timid, like a man unsure of where to place his pain. She stayed there, clutching the coffee cup, unable to take a sip. Time seemed to pass before her eyes without allowing her to react. She was about to submit to an agreement she never would have accepted voluntarily, all because of mounting debts and the influence of a man she didn't even know personally. When she finally decided to stand, there was a knock at the door. It was Lincoln, who entered with an expression filled with concern. He carried a folder of documents and, for a brief moment, seemed hopeful to deliver some good news. But his look quickly revealed otherwise. "I spoke with colleagues, tried one last push in the local courts. Nothing moved forward. With the year-end recess, everything slows down even more," he lamented, running a hand through his hair. "And with the money and connections this man has, no one is willing to challenge him right now." Leslie nodded, staring at the floor. It was confirmation of what she had already feared. Even Lincoln, with all his goodwill and legal expertise, couldn't make progress. She took a deep breath, absorbing the weight of the collective defeat. "So, that's it," she concluded, her words heavy. "There's nothing left, no loophole, no emergency hearing, no escape." Lincoln stepped closer and gently held her hands. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more. I'll try to stay close during the meeting, if you'll let me. Maybe I can step in if things get out of hand." She offered a faint, sad smile, letting the warmth of his hands comfort her for a fleeting moment. "Thank you. But I don't know if he'd let you get close. Either way, thank you for not abandoning me." They were interrupted by Leslie's father, who appeared in the hallway awkwardly, glancing between the two with a mix of curiosity and remorse. "Lincoln, are you staying for lunch?" he asked, unconvincingly. "I could try to whip something up, maybe." "No, thank you. But I have things to take care of at the office before the day ends," the lawyer replied, trying to be polite. "I'll stop by later to check on you." Once Lincoln left, Leslie took the opportunity to ask her father about how the handoff would proceed. "Do you know where I need to go? What time? How this will work?" The man swallowed hard, seeming embarrassed even to speak the details. "Yes, I have a paper I received yesterday. They want to pick you up by car late this afternoon and take you to a luxury hotel where a private event will take place. After that, I don't know what they intend." A chill ran down Leslie's spine, but she tried to keep her composure. "All right. I'll get ready and wait." Her father lowered his head, and Leslie could see he was on the verge of tears. Still, she didn't comfort him. She wasn't sure she could embrace him without unleashing all the resentment she harbored. Instead, she went upstairs, taking a long shower and choosing a simple but presentable outfit. Reluctantly, she recalled that the wealthy man likely expected a sophisticated companion, but she had no intention of impressing him. She still had her dignity. As the afternoon wore on, the air grew heavier. The overcast sky threatened rain at any moment. Leslie descended the stairs and found her father seated, head bowed, clutching an envelope with some papers. He looked at her with tearful eyes and said, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." She didn't respond, only observed him. It was too painful to speak. In a way, the scene confirmed how much the auto shop meant to him, and, ironically, how many mistakes he'd made in trying to save it. The appointed time came quickly. They heard the rumble of a powerful engine outside. Leslie took a deep breath and opened the door. Her father followed, his steps unsteady, to the gate. A black, luxurious car was parked there, the driver impassive at the wheel. As Leslie approached, the rear window rolled down, revealing a man in a dark suit she didn't immediately recognize. He extended a tablet displaying a countdown timer. "Please get in," the man said, emotionless. Leslie's father grabbed her arm for a moment. "Daughter, take care." He tried to finish the sentence but couldn't. The words stuck in his throat. She carefully pulled away, sparing herself further pain. She got into the back seat, and the car drove off, leaving behind a father who stood wilting on the sidewalk. From the window, she saw him slump his shoulders, invisible to the world that kept turning. That image shook her more than she cared to admit. During the ride, silence dominated the vehicle's interior. The man in the suit typed on his tablet, ignoring Leslie completely. She tried to guess how long the journey would take. Unfamiliar with that part of the city, she noticed they were heading toward the center, where towering luxury buildings rose. Gradually, they entered an upscale area, lined with high-end constructions, mirrored facades, and imported cars. Leslie gazed at the evening lights reflecting on the glass, feeling detached from her own body. Eventually, the car stopped in front of an elegant building with marble columns at the entrance and a gold-lettered sign displaying the name of a renowned hotel. Leslie swallowed hard. She had never been to such a sophisticated place. The driver exited to open the rear door, and she stepped out, feeling the night breeze against her skin. Inside, gleaming floors mirrored the expensive chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. A stern-looking receptionist gestured toward a private elevator, inviting them to ascend. Leslie still clutched her small bag, unsure whether she should introduce herself or say anything. But she noticed the man in the suit guiding her steps almost mechanically. When the elevator doors closed, she saw her reflection in the mirror, a weary face, yet determined to face whatever awaited. Her heart pounded louder with each passing floor. It's almost New Year's, she thought, wondering if this would be her last night, with any semblance of control over her life. The elevator stopped on a high floor. The doors opened directly into a carpeted hallway, with discreet lighting. A lone staff member holding a clipboard signaled to the man in the suit. Then, both escorted her down the quiet corridor lined with tall doors. The walls were adorned with abstract paintings, and the air carried a faint floral scent. Leslie realized she was barely breathing. The atmosphere was steeped in cold opulence, as if every object existed solely to flaunt someone's wealth. The man stopped in front of a set of double doors, gripping the metallic handle. He turned to Leslie and, with no expression, said, "Wait here for a moment. I'll announce you." She simply nodded, her lips tightly pressed. It wasn't long before he opened the door. She heard murmuring male voices inside. Then, the man motioned for Leslie to enter. The corridor behind her felt as silent as a tomb, and the tension became almost unbearable. Each step she took echoed against the floor until she reached the center of the room with its neutral tones. Indirect lighting framed a setting that resembled a private lounge, complete with dark leather sofas, glass tables, and heavy curtains draping wide windows. Two security guards ceased their conversation and stepped aside, allowing her to proceed. The air was as heavy as lead. In an instant, Leslie realized that, after all this time, she was finally about to meet the wealthy client, the man who had dictated the course of her life without ever showing his face. The thought sent a deep shiver down her spine. She took a breath, striving to maintain her composure. The silence grew almost tangible when, on the other side of the room, she heard the creak of a side door opening. A door opened, revealing for the first time the face of the wealthy client, who looked at Leslie as if she were a trophy. The millionaire client appeared at the side entrance of the hall, wearing an impeccable suit and maintaining a relaxed posture, as if every detail of the evening was under his complete control. His expression was cold, but carried a silent arrogance. Leslie felt a shiver run through her body as she faced, for the first time, the man who had dictated the course of her life without even knowing her. He took a few steps toward her, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing on the polished floor. "So, you're Leslie," he said, looking her over from head to toe. "I must admit, I was curious to meet you in person. I never imagined the owner of that garage would have a daughter like you." She held his gaze, even though inside she felt a suffocating palpitation. She was never the type to lower her eyes to veiled insults. "My father may have made many mistakes, but I never expected him to sell his daughter like a piece of property." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head in disapproval. "Spare me the drama. You'll attend a New Year's celebration with me. Nothing more. There will be food, drinks, the finest ambiance. In my view, it's a beneficial arrangement. All the debts will be cleared." Leslie swallowed hard, feeling her anger rise. "We'll see how far this nothing more of yours goes." He remained unbothered, gesturing toward one of the guards at the door. As if on cue, the men stepped aside, and the millionaire started walking toward an adjacent corridor, signaling for Leslie to follow. Before she could think of refusing, she realized there was no alternative. It was this or total chaos in her life and her father's. As they walked down the corridor, she noticed large windows revealing a panoramic view of the city, illuminated by the nighttime lights of New Year's Eve. For anyone else, the view might have been stunning. For Leslie, it was just a reminder that she was a prisoner in a scheme she hadn't chosen. They eventually arrived at a private event room. A central chandelier hung from the ceiling, reflecting crystal fragments. There was a well-set table with silverware and discreet floral arrangements. A few people mingled, all impeccably dressed, more like extras than actual guests. The man pointed to the center, where two chairs were positioned side by side. "Sit down. We'll wait for the right moment to toast the new year." Leslie complied, though her instinct was to run far away. As she settled in, a waiter appeared, offering her a drink. She declined, but the millionaire accepted, taking a slow sip. Though seething inside, she decided to observe her surroundings. Guards were stationed around the room, and only a few distinctive faces were present, likely his business associates. Everything about the setting screamed luxury and power, yet it felt incredibly hollow. Suddenly, amidst the tension, the hall doors opened. To Leslie's surprise, Lincoln entered, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his expression serious. Two staff members tried to block him, but he approached the millionaire with unwavering firmness. "Good evening. Apologies for the intrusion," Lincoln said, maintaining a polite tone. "I'm here to ensure no rights are violated tonight." The host raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised. "And who might you be?" "The family's lawyer and a friend," Lincoln clarified, looking directly at Leslie. She met his gaze, incredulous, but also relieved to see him. The millionaire let out a dry laugh. "This is a private party. If you're here at the young lady's invitation, I'll allow you to stand in a corner. But don't interfere." Lincoln nodded, accepting the concession. For now, being present was a victory. Staying close to Leslie might provide her some leverage, however small. She exhaled, feeling slightly more secure. At least, if something happened, she wouldn't face it alone. As the minutes passed, the attendees began to settle. The clinking of cutlery and glasses broke the silence, and Leslie tried to act as naturally as possible, though her instinct was to disappear. The proximity of the millionaire made her tense. He spoke little but surveyed the room with disdain, as if he considered himself above any law. It was nearing midnight when a commotion arose at the entrance. A sharply dressed man rushed in, whispering something to one of the guards. Shortly after, the millionaire was called aside for a private conversation. Leslie couldn't hear the details, but she noticed his expression change. Something was bothering him. He returned, trying to maintain composure, but moments later, another guard approached, whispering into his ear. He shot a furious look at Leslie and Lincoln. Apparently, something had slipped out of his control. "So, this is how it's going to be," the millionaire growled, stepping toward Leslie and pointing a threatening finger. You all planned to surprise me tonight, didn't you? Leslie, startled, raised her hands. I don't know what you're talking about. Lincoln stepped forward, keeping a calm demeanor but ready to defend her. If something's happening, we're unaware of it. At that moment, 3 police officers entered the hall, their faces stern, followed by a man Leslie recognized from afar, the informant who had nearly been caught by the goons at the warehouse. Despite being injured and limping, he carried a thick folder. Leslie's heart raced. One of the officers announced the millionaire's arrest, citing extortion and financial crimes. The man tried to defend himself, claiming it was a setup, but the evidence was solid enough for the police to act. The room descended into chaos. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to resist or comply. Lincoln, surprised, approached the informant, who explained, breathless, I discovered their schemes and found a legal loophole to expose them. I handed all the evidence to an honest officer who promised protection. As the millionaire shouted insults at the officers, Leslie stood frozen, feeling an odd sense of relief washing over her. It was as if the chains that had bound her for weeks were finally breaking. She looked at Lincoln, who seemed as stunned as she was, yet there was a glimmer of joy in his eyes. The turmoil lasted a few minutes until the millionaire was escorted out in handcuffs, still yelling threats. With his departure, the room emptied almost instantly, like a soulless place after the central piece was removed. Leslie could barely believe the dramatic turn of events. Suddenly, she was free from a forced meeting, from threats, and from insurmountable debts. Lincoln gently took her arm. Are you okay? Did he hurt you? No, I'm just trying to process what happened, she replied, her voice trembling. He smiled, and the informant, still limping, added, The evidence we gathered at the warehouse was enough. I had other documents stored away, too. After that, I knew I had to act before it was too late. I contacted the police and made all the arrangements. Leslie thanked him, overwhelmed, feeling an urge to embrace the man who had risked his life to help her. Through the hall's windows, she saw fireworks exploding in the sky. Midnight had arrived, marking the new year, and there she was, free from a blackmail scheme that had nearly crushed her dignity. As the moments passed and the scene quieted, Leslie, Lincoln, and the informant exited the building. The hotel, once a symbol of opulence, now seemed like an empty shell. They walked in silence to the taxi stand. The city's fireworks lit up the night sky, a kaleidoscope of colors celebrating the beginning of a new chapter. Leslie took a deep breath, feeling the crisp night air on her face. Though exhausted, she smiled softly. It was over. She was free. And for the first time in a long time, hope for a brighter future filled her heart. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.